This is Harvest Moon Homecoming, Sweet Haven Farm Sweet Small Town Romance, Book 1. Written by Jesse Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 1. Chapter 1. Fink vowed to stop the chaos. He glanced at the large Roman numeral clock on the wall of his office. With narrowed eyes, he turned back to stare out the big picture window overlooking the main entrance to the small Pennsylvania school. Monday morning, 8:43. Any minute now. He straightened his tie, then drummed his fingers on the desk. This had gone on long enough, and he was going to put a stop to it. Today. As if his determination had conjured it, the old blue Ford F-150 shot into view. Smoke billowed out of the tailpipe. The roar and rumble of the motor shook the window glass. No muffler. Rubber squealed and the passenger side wheels lifted from the pavement as the truck careened around the turn. The two heads inside the cab bobbled and jerked. As the truck slowed, the cloud of smoke engulfed it. It lurched to a stop with the front passenger tire on the sidewalk. Mr. Finkenbinder frowned and rubbed the side of his nose. He could never figure out whether Mrs. Bright parked that way on purpose or if it was truly an accident every time. He turned to the solid glass wall on his right. With all the privacy of a goldfish, Mr. Finkenbinder would never be accused of any impropriety. 3, 2, 1. Mrs. Bright barreled around the corner, her wild brown hair waving like Medusa's snakes, her hot pink pajama bottoms churning, her large orange t-shirt rippling like a flag in the wind, her muck boots clomping against the freshly waxed floor. "Hurry up, Harper, we're late!" The frightful woman turned to her daughter, who trailed behind her, unfazed. A small pang of envy zipped through his chest. How did such a crazy, irresponsible woman have such an organized, obedient daughter? And why, in the name of all that was holy, did the nephew who had been dropped on his doorstep this fall have to be more like Mrs. Bright than her daughter? "Crap! I forgot paper for a note." Mrs. Bright stopped and slapped her forehead. Harper tapped her mother's shoulder and handed her the sheet she carried on top of her neatly stacked books. "Oh, you're so wonderful, Harper. Thanks," she gushed, as if Harper didn't do that every Monday morning. Jordan Swoop raced by the window, screeched to a stop, backed up, and tapped Mr. Finkenbinder's window. "Are you lifting tonight, Mr. F?" He gave the kid a small smile and nodded. Jordan's grades had been high enough to keep him eligible for sports since last winter, but he was still holding Mr. Finkenbinder to the deal they'd made. Mr. Finkenbinder would help him with his academics, and Jordan would be his lifting partner. Jordan gave a thumbs up and hustled away. Mr. Finkenbinder had lost sight of Mrs. Bright and her daughter as they entered the office, blocked by one of the non-glass walls. But when they stepped up to the counter in the office, he could again see the odd pair through the window in his door. His nostrils flared and his smile disappeared. He reached for the intercom on his desk and depressed the button. "Mrs. Herschel?"
"Yes, Mr. Finkenbinder."
"Once you have authorized the late excuse and administered the tardy notice, would you please send Mrs. Bright into my office?" He looked down, adjusting the single sheet of paper on his pristine desk, but out of his peripheral vision, he sensed Mrs. Bright turn and stare straight at him. His big wall clock ticked 7 times before he lifted his eyes and met hers, which were a startling blue. She spun around.
I don't have time to meet with that pompous donkey today.
Because his door was cracked and her voice was raised, he heard her quite plainly. He could have yelled out the door to Mrs. Herschel. Some might say he should have, since this was a small country school with none of the metal detectors, door locks, and ID cards that other, larger schools had acquired in the last decade. The atmosphere of the school was casual. Mr. Finkenbinder didn't do casual. He depressed the button of the intercom again. Mrs. Herschel?
Yes, Mr. Finkenbinder.
If Mrs. Bright should find her schedule too full to grace me with her presence in my office, Mr. Finkenbinder could hardly believe he'd used Mrs. Bright's name and grace in the same sentence, but there it was. English was a complicated language. You may dismiss her and assign her daughter to room 1 for 2 hours of after-school detention.
Yes, Mr. Finkenbinder.
This time, Mrs. Bright whipped around and yanked open his door. It banged against the doorstop and lurched back, smacking her in the temple. She tended to lead with her head, as if she had horns. She swore. At him or the door. Maybe both. He did not look up, using the pencil in his hand to make a short remark about nothing on the paper in front of him, noting the scent of fresh pine filling his office. 10 ticks of the clock. He glanced up. Oh, Mrs. Bright. Why, you found time in your schedule to see me after all? How nice. Do come in. She walked in and slammed the door. Please, sit down. He gestured toward the 2 metal chairs facing his desk.
Let's not pretend we like each other, Fink,
she said with saccharine sweetness as she swiped a Tootsie Roll from the container on his desk and plopped down. Mr. Finkenbinder managed not only to withhold his growl, but to also plaster a pleasant, bland smile on his face. I'm sorry you feel that way, Mrs. Bright. He straightened the Tootsie Roll container so it aligned properly with the corner of his desk. She crossed her arms over her chest. He noted the nasty red swelling on the side of her head and squelched the compassion threatening to trickle up into his heart. Any sign of weakness on his part would give a woman like this too much of an advantage. Since I became principal of this school last year, I have noticed that almost every morning you arrive with your daughter at least 30 minutes late. Once or twice we could allow to slide by, but your daughter is missing important instruction in her first period class. You do want what is best for your daughter, Mrs. Bright?
Actually, no. I was thinking about chaining her to the railroad tracks on my way home tonight, Fink.
He set the pencil down with a snap, perfectly parallel with the edge of the paper, and refrained from commenting on her striking resemblance to a fire-breathing dragon. Mrs. Bright popped the Tootsie Roll into her mouth, threw the wrapper on his desk, and grabbed another piece of candy. Did she deliberately move the container? Only a slight bump, but his entire desk felt crooked now. Mr. Finkenbinder clamped down on his tongue as he picked up her trash, threw it in the trash can on the other side of his desk, and straightened the candy container. Next Wednesday, the Chestnut Hill School Board would meet for their regular monthly meeting. On that evening, they would choose a new district superintendent. Mr. Finkenbinder intended that his name be chosen. If he grabbed Mrs. Bright by her Medusa hair and dragged her out of the building screaming, it would lower his chances of improving his position in this district. I understand that it must be difficult for you to raise your daughter after the death of your husband. Was it possible for a wife to disorganize a husband to death? But I must insist on punctuality. Other students who are late face the consequences. She probably chewed her Tootsie Roll with her mouth open on purpose. Mr. Finkenbinder ignored the irritation threatening to close off his throat and focused on his speech. Harper is a contender to be valedictorian or salutatorian this year. Her tardiness is through no fault of her own. Because of that, I am reluctant to punish her. However, lest I be accused of playing favorites, there must be a consequence. I am prepared to apply the repercussion to the actual offender. You. Mrs. Bright rolled her eyes.
Right, Fink. I know you have it in for me. What did you want me to do? Sit in detention? Write an essay? Stand in the corner?
He waited. 15 ticks of the clock. Savoring the moment, containing his anticipation, he opened his mouth. Before he could speak, Mr. Dashel, the chemistry teacher, ran past his window. His hand left a grubby mark on the glass as he grabbed it with a clunk and screech to slow his pace enough to make the turn to the office. He still overshot. His hand disappeared and then reappeared, windmilling in the air. Mr. Finkenbinder said to no one in particular, since Mrs. Bright and he were not exactly on casual speaking terms, I do believe he was smoking.
God forbid there be a cigarette in the sanctuary.
She slouched in the chair and rolled her eyes. No, I mean, his body was smoking. Mr. Dashel barged into the office. He stopped short when his gaze landed on Mrs. Bright.
I'm sorry. Knock, knock.
He gave a sheepish smile. Mr. Finkenbinder did not return it. Smoke wafted up from the man's clothing. His left eyebrow was gone. Yes?
Didn't mean to interrupt, Mr. F., but the float we were making for homecoming exploded.
Good grief! Mr. Finkenbinder stood. It was possible an evil chuckle came from Mrs. Bright, but he chose to ignore it. Was anyone hurt?
No. You see, I thought if I combined hydroquinone and—
Later, Mr. Dashel. The police will be here any minute. There went his opportunity for superintendent. And the news media. You might want to, put yourself out. Mr. Finkenbinder gestured toward the smoke. He couldn't believe the fire alarm hadn't gone off. That would make his day complete. All 328 Chestnut Hill High School students wandering around outside, wasting valuable learning time, while the volunteer fire company sprayed Mr. Dashel's jacket with fire-retardant foam. Lovely. Wait. Mr. Dashel glanced at his arm and seemed startled to realize he was smoking.
The float explosion happened this weekend, and I forgot to tell you. I ran out of class as soon as I remembered.
He swatted at his smoking arm.
But we did have a small mishap in the room just moments ago. Nothing out of the ordinary. De rigueur, so to speak.
Mr. Finkenbinder blinked at the incorrect usage of de rigueur, but did not interrupt. With his head lowered, Mr. Dashel shuffled his feet before he continued.
Anyway, it reminded me of the explosion this weekend and the ruination of the homecoming float. I'm afraid the parents of the committee members have revoked permission for their children to help build it. We are floatless, and our volunteers have resigned.
Mr. Finkenbinder sat and resisted the urge to drop his head into his hands. The acrid odor of scorched material overpowered the fresh scent of pine and burned his nose. The parade was Saturday evening. First Mrs. Bright, now the homecoming float. The people in this community were laid back, but they had high expectations for the homecoming parade. every group from the Boy Scouts to the 3 members of the Backyard Barbecue Club would be in it. Mr. Finkenbinder thought again of the superintendent position and squelched a sigh. He could kiss it goodbye if there was no school float in the parade.
Well, it looks like you've got your hands full, so I'll just head on out.
Mrs. Bright hopped out of her chair and scurried toward the door. Sit, Mrs. Bright. I'm not finished with you. He hadn't gotten to deliver the good news about the repercussions she had coming to her for her continued tardiness. That would brighten his day considerably. He smiled at the pun. Thank you for letting me know about the explosion, Mr. Dashel. Who would have thought he'd have a casual conversation in his office with a smoking teacher about an explosion? Information his college education had not included. You may return to your class now, he said to Mr. Dashel.
Right, of course.
He scooted out the door, a skinny line of smoke trailing after him. Mr. Finkenbinder made a note to have the fire detection system examined. He waited for the door to click shut, then turned toward Mrs. Bright. Somehow a piece of her wild hair had caught on the corner of her lip. Normally this would annoy him, but he found himself noticing how pink and plump that lip was. Glossy. Kissable. He sucked in a breath as his heart jumped in his chest. To calm himself, he reached to straighten the one paper on his desk. He did not think Mrs. Bright's lip was kissable. Did not. Mrs. Bright sat up, looking one way, then the other.
What? What is it?
Mr. Finkenbinder took a deep, cleansing breath. Had the smoke in the room addled his brain? Nothing. Nothing. He slid the paper to the exact center of his desk, aghast to see his hands shaking. One problem at a time. Or not. He had been eager to extend the appropriate repercussions to Mrs. Bright, but now he had a more practical use for her. He willed himself to remain in control. I believe we were in the midst of a conversation about the proper punishment for your daughter's tardiness.
Right. My fault. My punishment. I'm on pine needles and a blowtorch just waiting to hear the verdict.
She touched her tongue to the corner of her mouth. Mr. Finkenbinder swallowed, loudly. He focused on her eyes. If you would like to keep your daughter and yourself from spending the next 2 weeks sitting in after-school detention for 2 hours each day, you may spearhead the building of the Chestnut Hill Homecoming Float. Mr. Finkenbinder laced his fingers together and placed them on the desk. Now that he'd noticed her mouth, he was having a hard time looking elsewhere. The rest of Mrs. Bright might be a hot mess, but her mouth was kissable. Definitely. He suppressed his wayward musings. He was a bachelor with a nephew to raise, and a principal, hoping to become the superintendent. He most certainly would not be kissing any parents. Not now, not ever. Mrs. Bright stared at him with her arms crossed. She'd been speaking and he'd missed her entire tirade. Those pink lips were set in a straight line. He cleared his throat. Easy guess that she just said she couldn't do the float. Actually, come to think of it, he probably didn't want her to. She couldn't be depended upon to get her progeny to school on time. What an insane idea to think she could make a float by Saturday. Fine. If you don't want to do the float, Harper can report to detention today after school.
Are you deaf, Fink? I just said I'd do the dang thing.
Her brows drew together. I'm sorry. I misunderstood. Disappointment that he wouldn't have the chance to saddle her with some nefarious consequence slid through his stomach. Still, she was certain to be late again. For now, at least he was getting the float taken care of. But, come to think of it, he'd better supervise. Drat. Give Mrs. Herschel directions to your house. I assume that's where you're doing it?
Yes.
She spoke without moving her lips, and her back teeth ground with small crunches. Great. May I presume you will not turn down help? Veins stood out on the side of her neck, but she shook her head. Then my nephew and I will be over this evening. What time do you think you will commence? Her boot clunked against the floor in a fast rhythm.
8.
That will suit. We will be there. She jerked her head, her wild hair flying everywhere, and stood.
Unless, of course, I contract pneumonia, malaria, and herpes in the next 12 hours. If only I could be so favored.
Mrs. Bright continued to mutter under her breath as she stomped out of the room. After confirming her address with Mrs. Herschel, she strode out. She did not look through his window as she walked by.
Mr. Finkenbinder, sir.
Mrs. Herschel's voice crackled over the small intercom speaker. He depressed the button. Yes.
You were not at the employee luncheon yesterday afternoon.
No, ma'am.
I see. Well, you should know Mrs. Kurtz had her home ec class cater it. No one consulted me, and I'm not sure who made that decision.
Mr. Finkenbinder groaned in his soul. Mrs. Kurtz was Mr. Dashel in female form. Only her experiments were intended to be ingested by humans.
The elementary school principal and 7 teachers have called in sick. I've exhausted our supply of substitute teachers, but each position is accounted for. Unfortunately, I still need one more chaperone and a bus driver for the field trip the 3rd grade is taking this afternoon.
He already knew he was acting as principal for both elementary and high school today, common practice when one of them were out. How much was he expected to do? He depressed the button, thinking to instruct her to cancel the field trip. Immediately, the superintendent position came to mind. Instead, he said, "That's fine. I'll do it." Chapter 2. Ellie shuffled papers around her desk. That darn receipt was here somewhere. She had just seen it. She moved several folders bulging with papers and slid a box containing scraps of ribbon out of her way, knocking over a cup containing glass beads in the process.
Shoot!
She jumped up and her chair toppled over with a crash. She cupped her hands at the edge of the desk, stopping the flow of cascading beads, and glanced under the desk for the receipt. She grimaced. The dust bunnies had morphed into dust dragons. Any receipts that had dared fall into their territory had no doubt been consumed. If she didn't know what the materials had cost, she wouldn't know what to charge for the wreath she had made. The shop bell jingled, and her mother-in-law walked into the small trailer that doubled as their seasonal shop and office.
I'm back here, Mom.
Ellie brushed most of the beads back into the cup and shuffled around the boxes and supplies littering the floor. The hoarders on television had nothing on her office.
Oh, there you are, honey.
Mom stopped at the doorway.
I just wanted to let you know that Dad and I are leaving for his appointment.
Ellie stopped short, automatically reaching up to steady a stack of boxes threatening to topple.
What? Dad and I are leaving for his appointment.
Her brows raised.
You forgot, didn't you?
Ellie glanced at the calendar. Several papers were clipped to it, and the bright sticky notes stuck to various parts. but the space for October the 7th was clearly visible, completely blank.
I did. I'm sorry. That's fine. You're busy. But we'll have to stop at the lab and get some tests done, so I doubt we'll be home before supper. You and Harper will have to handle the evening crowd by yourself. It's Monday. It won't be bad. Except I got hustled into doing the school float for the homecoming parade, so Harper and I will be working on that down at the shed. After 8, if you and Dad could close up? Of course, dear.
She waved and turned.
Oh, this wreath is absolutely stunning. I adore the burnt orange with that dark green. Thanks. I was just looking for the receipt for the beads so I could price it.
Mom sighed and shook her head.
You have so much talent. It's a crime for you to be holed up here on our little farm. I wish you had gone to art school like you had planned.
Getting pregnant with Harper at such a young age had shut down those plans. She and Liam had gotten married, and her main goal in life had been to be the best mom possible to Harper. Of course, when her husband had been killed in the paving accident, that goal had grown to include keeping the tree farm profitable. They had expanded their offerings from Christmas trees to a small apple orchard, pumpkins, a corn maze, hay rides, and their newest venture this year, a haunted barn. It had been insanely popular last weekend, which, of course, had kept her up until the wee hours of Monday morning. Drat that stiff-necked Mr. Finkenbinder. Like she had time to make a float in the middle of the busiest season of the year. If she had time, she'd have her own float in the parade. She realized her mother-in-law still stood in the doorway, looking at her.
I'm happy here, Mom. I'm glad, honey. See you later.
She walked out and Ellie glanced again at the calendar. She couldn't believe she hadn't written Dad's appointment down. With all the area schools booking field trips, she needed to keep on top of things and avoid scheduling conflicts. Thankfully, nothing had been booked for this afternoon. Her eye caught on a bright green Post-it note at the top of the calendar. She scuttled around the stacks of boxes and moved closer to read it. Chestnut Hill, 3rd grade, October 7th, 12 p.m. Crap. Crap. She groaned and glanced at her wrist to check the time, but her watch was missing, a casualty of her mad rush to get out the door this morning. Okay, she could do this. Normally, they had at least 2 employees on hand for group bookings, but if the bus driver would handle the tractor for the hay rides, she could probably handle the rest. It was a small school, only 40 or 50 students in each grade. She looked at the Post-it again. She hadn't written down any numbers. Smart. Just brilliant. If she were her own employee, she'd fire herself. Ellie charged out of the shop door. A heavy crash sounded behind her as she pulled it shut. She'd deal with that later, whatever it was. Right now, she needed to fill the metal tubs with water for apple bobbing. Mental note, she needed apples. And hot dogs. Wait, no hot dogs. Not with 3rd graders. Give those little darlings a sharp stick and an open fire, and an ER trip was inevitable. Had she restocked their apple supply? Maybe Mom had. Gosh, she hoped so. Did the tractor have gas? No, not gas. Diesel fuel. Holy smokes, she'd made that mistake 10 years ago. Never again. The tractor was probably out, or close to it. Dad usually took care of it, but Mondays were often slow. 10 minutes later, she had gathered glue and a few decorations for the kids who didn't want to climb on the hay bales, and filled 3 tubs with water. She dragged them, one at a time, across the cement floor of their main building, which was only a pole barn with bathrooms and a small stage. She decorated it herself with hay bales, gourds, pumpkins, and cornstalks. Indian corn hung from the posts, and orange lights glittered from the ceiling. Was one string of lights out? She twisted to get a better look. Her boot caught on the cement, throwing her to the floor, and the tub, rocketing along behind, slammed into her. It didn't tip over, but water splashed backwards, then sloshed forward, smacking her in the face and drenching her down to her boots. Half of her hair was soaked and hung in her face. She glanced down and snorted. She hadn't realized until now that she still wore her hot pink pajama pants. Pulling herself to her knees, she flexed her arms and legs. Nothing broken, just soaked. "Hello? Anyone here?" Her heart stopped. She recognized that voice. She'd just heard it this morning. No. If evolution were true and the Big Bang had really created this world, please, please, please let there be another Big Bang right now and take her out. Nothing. She flipped her sopping wet hair out of her eyes. Yep, it was Fink. Quite possibly the only guest they'd ever have visit the farm in a suit and tie. He hadn't quite gotten the look of horror on his face contained. It mirrored hers, she was sure. "I'm sorry, Fink, but if you're looking for the OCD convention, that was last week." He blinked. Then his irritating, placating smile settled back into place. "I'm so sorry to interrupt your monthly bath, Mrs. Bright, but the shop is empty. Could you please direct me to a responsible adult so I can check in my busload of kids?" She slapped a caricature of his smile on her face. "The bath is seasonal, Fink, and your interruption could be considered sexual harassment." His face drained of color as his smile slipped. He stepped back. A pang pinched her stomach. A small one. "I'm kidding. Holy cow, Fink. I'm fully clothed, down to my boots." His color still hadn't returned, and he'd backed out the door. All she could see was the red tip of his nose. He had a strong Roman nose. A nose with character, her mom would have said. Ugh. She shook her head. There was nothing about Fink remotely interesting to her. Even his strong nose. "Go wait in the office and I'll send someone in to take care of you." With as much dignity as she possessed, just in case he peeked back in, she pulled herself to her feet, turned on her heel, and strode out the back door. Her boots squeaked with each step, and she left a dripping trail of water in her wake, but it couldn't be helped. Once out, she sprinted across the yard to the house. 90 seconds later, she blasted back out of the house, now attired in overalls and a tee with a green flannel shirt over it. She'd put her boots back on, because her other pair took too long to lace up, and thrown her hair into a ponytail, the only way to get her hair to conform without a chair and a whip. Racing back to the modular trailer that contained the office and the shop, she hoped to sneak inside the back door of her office. Then she remembered she'd stacked last week's delivery of Christmas ribbon and bobbins and wrapping paper in front of it. 4 heavy boxes. Annoyed with herself for failing to keep up with everything yet again, she slunk around to the front door. It hung open. She set her lips and put one hand on her hip as she started up the wooden steps. Fink stood at the top, like he was afraid to enter. Grrr. Irritating man. Fine, she'd just push around him. That was when she saw the cause of the crash from earlier. The work table's leg had finally buckled. She'd been meaning to fix that wobbly leg all summer, but hadn't gotten around to it. too busy trimming Christmas trees and keeping up with the apple tree spraying schedule and trying to get a jump on making decorations to sell. Rats. It looked like most of her wreaths were intact, but pine needles covered the floor, along with broken corn stalks, twisted grapevines, and dried flower dust. Mom had also set paper plates, plastic flatware, cups, and napkins on the table. Plus, the whole mess was dusted with hot chocolate powder from a can which now lay on its side on the floor, the lid cocked at an awkward angle against the offending table leg, as though offering condolences. Fink was stalled at the top of the steps, not because he was afraid to enter, like she had thought, but because the jumbled mess blocked his way.
You might get a little cocoa powder on your shoes, but it'll wash off, I promise.
This must be my day for odd conversations. Fink backed against the open door and spread his arm out. Ladies first. A bus full of kids was waiting. She didn't have time to dither, or think of an appropriate set-down to his sarcasm. Ellie brushed past Fink, catching a whiff of his cologne. It smelled good. Not what she expected.
Focus.
Picking her way across the floor, careful not to step on any of her expensive wreaths, she reached the counter with a simple electronic cash register. Usually the receipt pad sat beside it. She moved the address stamp, a can of pens, the tray of orders, and a loose receipt. No pad, although there was a half-eaten hot dog under a few stray pieces of paper. Fine. She'd get started and maybe it would turn up.
How were you planning to pay?
Fink reached under his suit coat and pulled a folded check from his shirt pocket. I have a signed check from the school, written out to Sweet Haven Farm. There are 53 students on the bus, plus 3 chaperones. $10 for the students, plus a free pass for the bus driver, and half price for the chaperones. That's $540. He looked for a surface to write.
Actually, it's $545.
Catching him in a mistake made her feel marginally better. No. That smooth, meaningless smile was pasted on his face again. I did the figuring aloud for you. What did you not understand? She felt like a second grader who didn't understand borrowing.
I heard you do the figuring, and it was wrong. It's $545.
He sighed, but his smile did not slip, although his left eye twitched. Ellie bit back a smile. Mr. Unruffled was ruffled. And wrong.
53 students, she said in the same tone she had used to teach her daughter colors. Times 10 is $530. The bus driver is free, plus half price for 3 chaperones. That's...
That's where you went wrong, Mrs. Bright. Oh, she hated it when he called her that using that condescending tone. The bus driver is also a chaperone. She bit the inside of her cheeks, both sides. The metallic taste of blood trickled into her mouth. She could be a gracious loser, but she didn't have to like it.
Why, Fink, it appears that you were right. An odd occurrence for you, I'm sure.
It's possible she might have batted her eyes. As odd as you being able to find the receipt book? The smile fell from her face.
I use the receipt book every day. However, I am not the only person who works here. Someone else must have mislaid it.
She knew, even as she said it, that it wasn't true. She was the only one who had the problem losing things, breaking things, spilling things, running late, getting behind. Had to be why she couldn't stand Mr. Perfect. She walked behind the counter. Maybe it had fallen on the floor back there. Nothing. What was she going to do? If it were anyone else, she'd admit her problem and tell them they could pay later, or she'd stop in at the school and pick up a check. But not Fink. She couldn't allow him to get the upper hand. She stood up behind the counter. She'd just write him a receipt on a plain piece of white. "Is this it?" he asked, bending over in front of the counter. He straightened, holding the receipt book in his hand.
"It is."
She plastered on her brightest smile, resisting the urge to lurch over the counter and grab the book. "I believe your boot was on it."
"I believe you—" "Never mind."
She snatched it from his hand and scribbled out a paid receipt.
"I'm a little short-handed today. Do you think your bus driver would be interested in driving the tractor for the hay rides? I would pay her for it."
Fink's lip drew back. "No, I don't believe he would."
Maybe we could ask him?"
Ellie's eyes narrowed. Fink shifted on his feet, staring at the ceiling behind her head. She thought he whispered super, but she couldn't be sure. Finally, he said, "He'll do it."
"Okay."
The only thing she could figure was that Fink had an odd relationship with the bus driver. She wasn't going there. She had enough to deal with.
"Right, so there's 3 of you, 1 of me. We can divide the kids into 4 groups and set up 4 stations: bobbing for apples, going to the pumpkin patch, the corn maze, and, of course, the hay rides. I'll show the driver where we go. It's simple."
"You might as well tell me now."
"What?"
"I'm the bus driver." She stared. Her eyes traveled from his suit coat to his dress pants to his black leather dress shoes, back to his face. Bland. She laughed.
"I didn't think you had a sense of humor, Fink."
He waited for her to quit laughing. "I'm not kidding." She swallowed.
"Can you drive a tractor?"
"I have a Class A commercial driver's license with a passenger endorsement."
"No, you don't need a license. I'm asking, can you physically do it?"
"I was born in Iowa. We drive tractors to preschool." Ellie narrowed her eyes and tilted her head.
"Did you just joke?"
"No joke. Just facts, ma'am." Was that a hint of a smile? Couldn't be. She picked her way back through the shop mess to the open door.
"Don't call me ma'am, like I'm 15 years older than you."
"You have an 18-year-old daughter. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out your approximate age." That's what he thought, and she did not want to go there. She grabbed a pair of scissors off the shelf and put them in her back pocket.
"Come on, let's get these kids off the bus."
Fink followed her path through the mess. The bus should be unloaded, and the kids should be waiting in the fire pit area. They were. Fink was nothing if not organized. It occurred to her to offer him a change of clothes, especially after one of the other chaperones told her he'd been tapped just today to fill in after some sickness had gone around the school. But he was much taller than her father-in-law, and she'd have to cut the toes out of Dad's boots to get them to fit. Plus, she really couldn't imagine Fink in bib overalls and practical boots anyway. Although part of her, a part she immediately shut down, thought he might look pretty good. It was the nose. Man, she was such a sucker for a strong nose. Or maybe it was the character such a nose represented. Thoughts about his clothes made her notice how broad his shoulders were. Paired with his height and his Roman nose, well, someone, certainly not her, but someone, might think he was quite a catch. Good for them. She ended up supervising the trips out to the pumpkin patch, which, truth be told, was always her favorite job. The vines had been killed off by frost, but the vibrant orange pumpkins, contrasted with the brilliant blue sky and brown earth, always cheered her. Orange was such a happy color. The pumpkins were randomly scattered throughout the patch, and she loved looking for patterns. 5 grouped here, 8 there. No 2 pumpkins the same either. Short, fat, long, and tall. 2 big ones and 2 little ones in a group. 3 big and 1 small in another. She loved watching the kids run from pumpkin to pumpkin and guessing which kid would pick which pumpkin. What made them finally decide this is it? Invariably, some would go to the farthest corner, the patch was 3 acres, and choose one too large to carry back. She loved those overachievers. Reminded her a little of the randomness of the universe and how some people ran from person to person to person, looking for the perfect mate. What made them finally settle on someone? And those overachievers? That would be like her setting her cap for Fink. Ha! But she'd already had a husband, and she'd chosen him like the kids who set 1 foot in the patch and choose the pumpkin closest to them. Liam and she had been in the same class at Chestnut Hill from kindergarten to 9th grade when she'd gotten pregnant. Liam had been a good father and an okay husband, but she wondered if she might have found something better, more exciting, if she'd wandered farther into the patch. She squelched a laugh. Maybe Liam was the one who should have gone farther in. Well, it was over and done with. She'd already picked a pumpkin and she didn't need to. Not in this lifetime. At least she'd ended up with great in-laws and the best daughter in the world. As she waited for this group of kids to choose, she could see almost the entire hayride route. Not that she was watching Fink. Oh, please. But it was kind of interesting to see the buttoned-up, prosaic principal maneuvering the red tractor. She had to admit, he was proficient. He probably had been serious when he said he was from Iowa, which made her wonder what in the world he was doing in central Pennsylvania. Was this seriously the only place he could find a job? A little boy tugged on her sleeve.
"Hey, lady, Izzy isn't picking a pumpkin out."
She'd missed the little girl who hung at the edge of the patch, a bright pink clip stuck in her curly black hair. Picking her way through, watching that the vines didn't trip her, she walked to Izzy.
"Hey, I'm Ellie."
Izzy looked up and gave a small smile. Ellie squatted down.
"Do you want a pumpkin?"
Izzy looked out at the field, then at her feet.
"I think they're too heavy."
She bit her lip and watched as the other kids ran from pumpkin to pumpkin.
"Some of them are pretty heavy, but you don't have to pick a big one."
Izzy dug her toe in the dirt. Ellie leaned in toward Izzy and whispered,
"If you pick one that's too heavy, I'll carry it for you, but don't tell anyone else, or I'll end up having to carry everyone's pumpkins."
Izzy smiled, her white teeth glistening in her dark face. Ellie straightened.
"I'll hold your hand. You've got to watch these vines. They like to trip you up."
Izzy slipped her hand into Ellie's and they picked their way through the patch. As she helped Izzy find the perfect pumpkin, she couldn't help but go back to her earlier thoughts on dating and pumpkins, because she'd just realized something about herself. Izzy hadn't wanted to get a pumpkin because she'd been afraid of not being able to handle it. Was fear the reason, the real reason, Ellie hadn't dated since Liam died? If so, what, exactly, was she afraid of? Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.